Hey folks, lecture 4 for nutritional approaches to muscle gain. This time, ranges of weight gain and durations of weight gain to make sure we're on the right track for gaining the most muscle and hopefully the not greatest amount of fat. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about, first of all, answering the question of why weight gain is important for muscle gain, because a lot of people say, well, I don't want to gain muscle, but I don't want to gain weight. It can be valid in some circumstances, not valid in others. We'll explore that. We're going to talk about in great depth how progress is actually measured. Like, how do you know that you're probably gaining muscle, right? Versus just spinning your wheels. Muscle gain is a cool word, or is a cool phrase to say, and you can say that what you're doing is muscle gain, but you might not be. And how do we know? Well, by measuring, we'll figure out how. We're going to talk about the potential problems of gaining too slowly, as well as the problems of gaining too quickly. So we're going to set a nice middle range there. We're going to find out what that range is. And then that's going to be reflected in our discussion of best gain rates. Then we're going to talk about the problems of gaining for too short of a length of time. Like if you say, I'm in a muscle gain phase, and you gain for a day, and then you start cutting, clearly that's too short. We'll talk about other situations that are too short as well. Gaining for too long and what the downsides there can result in. And, of course, we'll end with best gain durations. So kind of give a good sort of rubric, a working guide of, what is an appropriate amount of time to dedicate oneself to the muscle gain process before switching gears. All right, first up, why is weight gain important for muscle gain? In other words, why can't we just maintain the same weight and just aim for quality gains? I just want lean tissue. I don't want to get huge. Well, we actually can, and you can gain some muscle by gaining no weight at all, and even losing fat during the process to such an extent that you lose weight, or losing just enough fat and gaining the concomitantly similar or equal amount of muscle that leads to a stability of weight. So for example, you could be 170 pounds, 20% body fat, and months or years later you can be 170 pounds and 15 or 10% body fat. That means you have more muscle, less fat. It's possible, but it's not very reliable, especially for individuals that have been training for quite some time, are relatively advanced, they're already pretty lean. What we mean by reliable is that you want to give yourself the best chances for muscle growth, and sometimes under not so great conditions, we don't actually get much or any muscle growth unless we give ourselves the best chances, right? So if you stay at 170 pounds and you do everything you can to gain muscle except gaining weight, after months and months of work, sometimes it's not really clear if you gained muscle or not. And that's an awful waste of months and months. Why don't you give yourself the advantage, gain some weight so you can be almost sure you've gained some muscle, or certainly give yourself the best opportunity. So what we mean by reliable is if someone comes up to you and they said, look, I've been training for 5 years pretty hard, I've been dining really well, I weigh 170 pounds, and I want to gain muscle for sure. Do you think I should just maintain my weight and just train and eat? It would not be factual to say that you could reliably do that. So your advice to them would be like, I wouldn't count on for sure gaining muscle. It's possible, but I certainly count on it. And look, if you're gaining muscle and it's important to you, you kind of want to do something reliable. Right? It makes a little bit of sense. And even if it's reliable, it's not the optimal way to go. So even if you can guarantee someone that's relatively untrained or maybe hasn't done a formal diet before, or is a very high body fat percent, is on the way down, you can almost guarantee them they're going to gain muscle. So it's reliable, but it's not optimal. They could gain more muscle if they gained weight at the same time. And we'll talk about why, right? So there's kind of a soft limit and a hard limit for maintaining the same weight and trying to gain muscle while losing fat at the same time. The soft limit is this: recomposition is a lot slower and harder than just net gains. Right? When you're recomping, when you're trying to gain muscle and lose fat at the same time, remember, there's a myriad of strategies for losing fat, and there's a myriad of strategies for gaining muscle. A lot of strategies completely contradictory. For example, weapon number one, so long as you're eating enough protein, of gaining muscle is a hypercaloric diet, eating more calories than you need. Weapon number one, by a long shot, of losing fat is a hypocaloric diet. Now, how the hell are you supposed to do both those at the same time? If you try that, it's isocaloric, and it's not good for either one, right? It's like someone's like, okay, do you guys want to do, do you want to play, paintball or basketball? And someone's like, oh, how about both? Like, that would just be a really crappy game where you get shot in the face with a paintball gun when you're trying to shoot hoops. Maybe I just invented the next greatest game, and I'm just going to eat my words, but probably not. Some things are just better left alone, and recomposition kind of makes two things that are much better alone fight each other, particularly hypo and hypercaloric dieting, right? So if you do want a recomposition, the sort of soft limit there on gains, this is just not the fastest way to do things. It's just a lot harder. Now, a lot harder for intermediates. For advanced people, it could be damn near impossible. And you certainly don't want to set yourself up for impossibilities. Now, the harder limit is this. You can recomp at 15% body fat, if you're female at 20, if you're male for sure at 20, and everything above, you can almost certainly, because you have lots of excess fat and your body's not so worried about getting rid of it, like it gives it up pretty easily, that you can potentially gain muscle and lose fat at the same time. When your fat dips to below 10% for males and 15% for females or thereabouts, your body gets real concerned about your body fat and holding on to as much of it as possible. That is when you want to employ a hypocaloric diet to give that added boost to fat loss, because without a hypocaloric diet, you're probably not going to lose a whole lot of fat or anything at all, no matter what you do with your nutrient timing, your macros, or anything like that, if you're already at 10% or 15% for females. So the hard limit is this. If you want to recomp, and let's say you get to 170 pounds, you want to be jacked. You get to 170 pounds and you're now at 9% body fat or 14% if you're a female. How much muscle are you going to add? Your body's not giving up any more fat, which means you're not going to add any weight for muscle. Because if it's not losing any more fat, how are you going to gain muscle? You have to gain net weight. What if you say, oh, I'm not getting net weight? You're just going to go nowhere. So at some point, this process breaks down. And if you really want to put on more muscle, you have to gain weight at some point, right? Now, a lot of folks think, I'm too fat to be gaining weight. You'll get females that are 26% body fat, and they'll say, I'm not going to go on a gain phase. Look how fat I already am. Where the heck am I going to go with this gain phase? I'm just going to balloon up and it's going to be crazy. The thing is, a muscle gain phase needs to be hypercaloric for optimum results, but nobody said hypercaloric means you IV Oreos into yourself and gain a pound a day. A really reasonable mass gain can be as easy as gaining 5 pounds over 3 months' time. Look, you gain 5 pounds of tissue over 3 months. You don't look super different. Your belt stuff doesn't fit differently. When do clothes start fitting differently? When do you start looking differently to different people that see you? Man, 10 pounds, 15 pounds for sure. 5 pounds is barely anything. You're just really not going to be that much fatter. And maybe just a couple pounds of that will be fat. The rest will be muscle. So there's not a ton to worry about. I think a lot of people, when you say, hey, weight gain is really a good thing with muscle gain, they say, oh my God, weight gain. And then they're like 140 pound, CrossFit or female, and they're like weight gain. And the first image that comes to mind is like 450 pound, like Jabba the Hutt, like eating Princess Leia, right? This is not exactly what happens. You go from 140 to 145 over 3 months, you gain yourself plenty of muscle and nobody even noticed that you even got, remotely fatter, because by percent you barely did. So this doesn't mean extremes, but some weight should probably be gained for best results. All right. Measuring progress. Here's the deal. How do we measure progress? How do we know if we're gaining muscle gaining weight and specifically gaining muscle? There's a couple of ways. One, and probably one of the most important, is body weight. Multiple trackings of body weight per week are best. 2 or more, up to 7 is fine. But, if you have like 3 or 4, you're canceling a lot of the noise out. You take those averages per week. So you take 3 or 4 body weight measurements per week, or even 7. You average them. That's your weekly average. The next week, you do the same thing. You take a weekly average. If your weekly average is going up, you're gaining weight. And because you're gaining weight under a situation where you're hopefully training logically and your nutrition is good and you're getting plenty of rest, then you're probably gaining some muscle. Now, the degree of muscle gain is going to depend on your genetics, your training age, so on and so forth. But more or less, you're doing something, right? You're definitely headed in the right direction. Second one, your repetitions you're getting on your lifts, or keeping repetitions constant, how strong are you? For example, let's say your best set of squats is 200 pounds for 10 reps. If months later you're squatting 220 for 10 reps, or if months later you're squatting 200 for 13 or 14 reps with the same level of effort, let's say to failure or something like that, then that improvement is a sign that something got better. Now, if it's a new exercise or if it's a compound movement, especially that you haven't done in a while, nervous system alterations can make strength gains and endurance gains for you in exercise. So it's a little harder to tell if that's muscle, if that's the nervous system, technique, so on and so forth. But generally speaking, if you've done the movements a while, it's not probably neural learning, and at least some of that muscle mass is going to be, some of that strength gain is going to be related to that muscle mass. It's going to be indicative of muscle mass. In addition to that, over long-term years, there's just stuff you can't do with neural alterations. You don't go from squatting 315 for sets of 10 to squatting 365 for sets of 10 because you learned how to squat better. But you probably knew how to squat pretty well by the time you were hitting 315. 365 for 10, you just plain old have to have bigger legs. I mean, the muscle just doesn't come, or the strength just doesn't come from the magic nervous system fairy or something like that. A way to obviate this technical thing, there's two ways, two good ones. One, use exercises that you do really, really frequently, sort of all the time. Squats, bench presses, deadlifts, pull-ups, bent rows. You might never really remove them from your program or use very close variations, but never get away from the basic moves. And if you're using those and doing those, man, if they're going up, it's probably not because you're getting better at them early. You do something for 3 years, your nervous system improvements are very, very small. Most of the improvements are going to come from muscle size, right? Makes very good sense. Another way to obviate this technical problem is to focus in your training on compound heavy basics with some isolations, but use the isolations more to measure. So for example, how much neural efficiency are you going to be able to make on a leg press, on a hack squat, on a machine chest press where you're pinned in and the range of motion is predetermined? There's just really nowhere to go. It really has been shown that more isolation moves, and not necessarily even isolation, but more machine moves that restrict your motion and your technique. Like, what's your hack squat technique's damn near the same all the time. After the first 6 or 8 weeks, you pretty much have your technique down. If you use those machines, that's a pretty good way to tell that you're gaining muscle. So nervous system-wise, you could get really good. Oh, I have a virus and threat protection Windows Defender summary. Isn't that nice? Thanks, Windows. Don't take that out, Scott. You can just leave that in. People need to know about viruses. So if, your low bar squat can go up by, 50 pounds potentially in several months just because you figured out the technique really well. But once you have the hack squat down, that kind of only goes up if your legs get bigger, right? And that's a good way to use that stuff. Point number 3, mirror appearance and clothes fit. So if you look more jacked in the mirror, you might be more jacked. And especially if you're honest with yourself, or even if you're like a little pessimistic, like when you start to notice that your traps look pretty different, yeah, they're probably bigger, right? And it's really possible to track things in the mirror. It's quite subjective, but if you've been doing it for long enough, you can at least use the following test. If you really just don't look any different in the mirror, you can say, okay, I can't be sure that I gain muscle, right? Because you don't want to cut yourself slack and be like, oh, I gained muscle because I maybe could look a little different. But if it's staring you in the face like, oh my God, what happened to my pecs? Like, why are they so big? You probably gain muscle. It's probably not a light trick. Another one, and of course, you never use mirror by itself. And we'll get to that in a second. Another one is clothes fit. Like if you, for the first time ever, got up to 180 pounds from weighing 160, your belt went up like 1 inch, and your waists on your shirts and stuff and are fitting pretty normally, but like you can't fit your pants around your glutes and your quads, and your chest is like busting buttons open on your collared shirts, yeah, you probably put on some muscle. On the other hand, if your arms don't feel any tighter, if your legs don't feel any tighter, but it's getting 3 or 4 belt notches up from where you used to be, maybe you gain quite a bit more fat, quite a bit less muscle. It's subjective, but it adds to the picture, and the adding to the picture is a really big part of this. What about formal body composition measurement devices? Can use DEXAs, bod pods, skin folds, BIAs. BIA, bioelectrical impedance analysis, is okay to use in statistical trials and research populations, large groups of athletes. For the same person over time, it's largely an appropriate measure because the error rate is like really kind of nonsensical. If you take a BIA twice a week the entire year, you might actually be able to get some good reliability data. So it's going to give you a body fat. You can see if it's going up or going down, and that'll be accurate. The actual body fat itself, especially for people that are very muscular and lean, such as yourself, it's more or less a make-believe number. How make-believe is it? A lot of BIAs have a button you press that says athlete or non-athlete, and it gives you like 10% differences in body fat. What the hell is that? It's not clearly not measuring anything that actually, directly is accurately impinging on whether or not your whatever muscle and whatever fat. So it's a huge grain of salt for BIA, but it's fine if you use it all the time and take it all year round. Skin folds. A really good skin fold practitioner can give you a real general range of what you're at, but I'll put it to you this way. There's a 3 or 4% margin of error for good skin fold practitioners, which means what? If you gained 3% muscle, which is ungodly amount of muscle, that's huge gain. It took you 6 months. The skin fold could say that's all error and could say you didn't change at all. So how often should you skin fold yourself? Man, I don't know. If you have a really good practitioner, once a month could give you real general trends. But what I'll say in a bit is all this other stuff is going to make up for that and make it very clear where the skin fold just adds data you don't even need at that point. Bod pod is okay, not super duper accurate, better than skin folds. DEXA is very accurate, but the level of accuracy and precision it has doesn't does not have the power yet to track over weeks of muscle or even months of muscle or few months. What I would do is I would get a DEXA once or twice a year if I had access to one. Bod Pod, same thing, but DEXA is preferred. When you do a DEXA once or twice a year, you can track long-term changes in muscle and fat. Here's the thing, take them at the same time in every phase. If it's at the end of a fat loss phase, once, take it the next time at the end of a fat loss phase, because body water and stuff have huge effects on DEXA results. If you take it at the end of the same kind of phase, once or twice a year, you get a pretty good picture. Remember the DEXA results taken with a grain of salt, because sometimes the error is going to be either making you think that you're Superman, you'll lose 10 pounds on a fat loss phase and gain 2 pounds of muscle, unlikely, right? And then the next time you gain 10 pounds on a muscle gain phase and it says you only gain 2 pounds of tissue, of muscle, and you're super disappointed, or it says you lost muscle. I've seen that before. So take it with a grain of salt. Here's how I would use these measures. So I would focus over the weeks on body weight and rep lifts. Is your body weight going up within the ranges? And we'll talk about what those are. Are your rep lifts going up, or lifts on your compound movements and your isolations? Are you getting stronger for reps? If that is doing well over weeks, you're doing great. On mirror appearance and close fit, just keep an eye on that over the course of, multiple months, 3 months, sort of take a sort of, okay, my clothes are fitting pretty well and a little tighter in the arms and chest and back and not so much in the waist, then you're good to go. And then yearly for DEXAs and bod pods, skin folds, BIAs, be really careful with that stuff. I wish I had better news for you guys, to be honest. We're going to cut you the real deal here in RP Plus. So I wish there was a really good body fat assessment device. There probably will be in the future, but currently, unless you can... a really good one, actually, you can probably take once a week is MRI. Now, if you can afford $1,000 a week and afford I'm sure at a hospital, if you just came up with cash and be like, I hit my head again, I need a full body MRI, some doctor might be able to do that for you. It just costs a lot to run the device, so unlikely. That's like, if I'm ever a trillionaire, I'm just going to get an MRI machine at home and just scan my limbs after each meal. That'd be really sweet. So here's the deal, folks. Any one of these by themselves does not give you the whole picture. If you use all of them, especially the first 3, and they're all conciliant, they all point in the same direction, that's good data. So for example, if your body weight is going up, if you're getting stronger for reps, and your mirror appearance, you're looking more jacked, not too much fatter, and your clothes are fitting like a more jacked person's, you're almost certainly gaining muscle. On the other hand, if some of them are discordant, then I just wouldn't be super confident. Keep doing what you're doing, but maybe play with the approach a little bit. Double and triple check your approach to make sure you're doing some good stuff. For example, your body weight is going up, but your rep lifts are like, and you're kind of gaining a little bit of fat in the waist and not in a whole lot of other places as far as gaining a circumference and girth for either your mirror appearance or your close fit. Are you gonna, if you were to ask me, like, hey, am I gaining muscle? Like, man, I'd really like to see your strength for reps go up. That's probably one of the better ones. And I just, without it, I don't know. It could just be you're gaining fat, right? Or if you're getting stronger and your mirror appearance is looking good, but you're not gaining body weight, man, where's that muscle going? It's supposed to be gaining it. Where is it really? So if all of the 3 top things align, and of course, especially if the 4th, body composition analysis, if all of them align, you're golden. If they're discordant, give it some thought. If all of them say you're not doing so well, you're almost certainly not gaining muscle. So that's how I would interpret that. Now, let's say we're trying to gain. We talked about weight gain being an important factor. And all right, so, weight gain is good, but what if we gain super, super slowly? Let's say we're really afraid of fat gains. What are some problems with that? And remember, the purpose of this discussion is to eventually get us into normal weight ranges. To pick logical weight ranges that are very effective, we have to essentially refute very slow gains and very fast gains, and how we refute them will constrain us to a certain effective range. So if we decide to gain super duper slow, what are the problems with that? And super duper slow we're defining as, a very clear definition, less than 0.25%, 0.25% of body weight per week. Right? That means if I am 200 pounds and I gain less than half a pound per week, what am I risking there? Remember, half a pound's okay. 0.25 is okay. Less than that, right? Significantly less. What's the problem there? First is the weight tracking problem. How do you track 1 pound per month? How in the hell is that possible? I've seen recommendations out there. You can gain a pound. You should be gaining a pound per month. A pound per month? Here's the real big problem with that. you could have a caloric intake and a balance of energy expenditure that results in a 1 pound per month weight gain. But you would be blind to the directionality or the question of that weight gain for months until your weight averages exited the zone of just probability and fluctuation. Here's what I mean. You keep your calories constant, but you eat some salty food. Your weight's 3 pounds up the next day. You go to the amusement park with your friends. Your calories are great. Everything's fine. You ate normally, but you get a little dehydrated and your weight is 6 pounds down from that high one, 3 pounds down from the average. Weight calibrates, right? All the time, and it is never constant, and it goes up and down, up and down, up and down. So that's what we call noise in a statistical analysis, and the only way we can conclude that you're getting actual weight gain is once that weight gain exceeds at least the band of statistical noise. Because if it doesn't, we can't say you're probably gaining weight because it could just all be noise. So for example, if we're getting a pound a month, let's say we start in August, and then on September 1st, we look at our weight averages, and on average, it looked like we weigh, 150 pounds. All right, sweet. Then September, and on average, it looks like we weigh 151 pounds. Like, okay, that's cool. Like, I guess we're on track. October comes around, and it turns out, the reason that we were weighing so much is it was because it was really humid or something like that. So September, as we sort of drank more water, and because it wasn't as dry, we didn't expel more as sweat. And just a couple of weeks of that on average led us to retain just a little bit more water. Right? We started a new allergy medication and just retained a little bit more water. There's about 500,000 things that can make your weight on average a pound heavier. But it's pointless to even count them all. In October, our weight average is 149 pounds. So what the fuck, for lack of a better term, have we been doing for 3 months now? We've been telling people that we've been gaining weight. We've been telling ourselves we've been gaining weight. We're on a muscle gain plan, bro, but we've gained negative 1 pound? That's awful. That's 3 months damn near pissed away. Now, were you training hard? Of course. Did you probably gain some lean tissue just from training hard? Of course. But you're basically doing a recomposition diet. We just can't be sure, right? Is there theoretically a problem with gaining that slow? Yes, there is, and we'll talk about it later. But probably the bigger problem is you can't even tell if you're gaining. When can you tell if you're gaining? Well, at least 3 months and up, and you should be up 3 pounds. And if you're not, then probably you're not going fast enough. Well, geez, 3 months pissed away. I don't know about you guys, but I'd like to know if I'm pissing away time after a few weeks, not after a few months. Right now. Point number 2 is probably the more direct critique here. Actual muscle gain is faster with faster rates. They've done multiple studies. The more you eat, the faster you gain, the more muscle you gain. Problem, you gain a whole hell of a lot more fat too. But muscle gain is also there, right? And it's higher the more food you eat, up to a point that's probably pretty high, like 2% per week, which is insane. We're not recommending that. But if you go these needless rates, people say, man, I just want to gain, like half a pound a month or something. You could just gain more muscle if you accepted a little bit of fat gain. And we'll talk about later how we can just deal with the fat, no problem, right? So that's a big deal. Actual muscle gain is just literally going to be faster. You're going to be telling yourself, hey, I'm going slow. It's on purpose. Your buddies are going to be going around you, eating more food, having more fun, hitting bigger PRs, and getting more muscular. And they go like, yeah, but they're getting fatter. And then they do a 6-week mini cut, get rid of all their fat, and they're way ahead of you. They're months ahead of you. And you're like, damn, why the hell am I going so slow, right? It's almost like being worried about speed on the freeway, getting you hurt in a car accident, and only ever going 15 miles an hour. Look, the probability of a fatal crash doesn't really start until 30, 45 miles an hour. So if you're going 15 miles an hour just to be super safe, you could go 30 miles an hour and it'd be basically just as safe from anything serious happening to you. Is there an argument against going 90? For sure. But if you're doing 15 and everyone's doing 30, there's really not really much of a defense there, right? Here's the deal. Really, really buttressing point number 2. Fat gain is faster too when you gain faster than 0.25% a week. But fat can be lost much easier than muscle is gained. You can lose 0.75% of body weight in fat, in pure fat, every single week for 6 weeks straight without hardly risking muscle at all. People do this all the time. It's routine, right? As a matter of fact, if you just check the major boxes, losing a lot of muscle during a fat loss phase is really actually quite difficult, right? In the sense that it's just not very likely. So there's a low risk to muscle loss there. You can lose a ton of fat. So here's the deal. If you go a little bit faster, right, than 0.25% per week while you're gaining weight, and then you just take a couple of weeks to get rid of the fat, then you're back to square one with 4 pounds of muscle on you at the exact time that a slower gainer is only up to 2% you're up to 4 pounds of muscle. They're at 2 pounds of muscle. You're 2 pounds of muscle ahead of them, and they're saying, but you're fatter, and you're like, no, actually, I'm not fatter. As a matter of fact, I'm leaner than you now because I cut off all the fat that I gained in that short window of time. So it's basically like, if someone tells you, hey, listen, I don't ever work more than 6 hours a day or more than 4 hours a day, because I work every day and I'll just accumulate way too much fatigue and just lose my mind if I work more than that. And you say, hey, what if you worked 8 hours a day, but you took 2 days off every week and you fully let the fatigue come back, and then you could grind again for 8 hours a day? You're like, oh, I never really thought of that. I guess you'd get a lot more work done. Well, yeah, no shit, but that's why we have weekends, right? There's a reason that pulsatile phasic behavior is advantageous, because you get the best of both worlds, right? If it works like that, and it does in muscle gain for sure. So when people say, hey, you shouldn't be gaining that fast, you're getting fatter, it's okay to a point, because you can lose the fat no problem. Fat loss is easier than muscle gain by a long shot. So we have to integrate that into our approach, right? In other words, point number 4, gain faster, lose fat, and repeat is a better process than just super slow gain. We don't have to be needlessly afraid of gaining because we can always lose the fat. Is there a point at which there's too much of a good thing? Absolutely, and we're going to talk about that next. So, problems with gaining too fast. Clearly, we've made a hell of a case that gaining too slow is probably a bad idea. What about gaining too fast? Let's say we just decide to get huge, just monstrous. What's going to go on there? What do we define as too fat? Well, our range is pretty narrow here. More than 0.5% of body weight per week. So basically, if you weigh 200 pounds, right, and you're trying to gain more than about a pound a week, let's say 2 pounds a week. Now, 2 pounds a week takes a lot of eating, by the way. That's if memory serves, roughly 1,000 calorie surplus every day. Now, that's gnarly, right? So let's say you decide to go that route. What are some of the downsides? Well, the first thing is that for at least a couple of weeks, you get a huge food volume and this gnarly mega bloat that can mask the tracking process. When I'm really pushing my body weight, even with 0.5% per week, I get like a 5-pound perma bloat from just eating that much food and that much water in the GI tract plus food. When I switch from mass gain to maintenance, I just drop 5 pounds automatically. None of it's tissue. It's just bloat. A lot of it's GI bloat, subcutaneous bloat from just stuffing yourself with that much food, right? So if you decide to go real fast, for weeks on end, you can't tell what's bloat and what's actual tissue gain. So you'll be like, oh, it's okay. I'm up 10 pounds in 2 weeks, but that's just bloat. Maybe it's a lot of bloat. Maybe it's a lot of fat. So we can't quite tell. Tracking problem. Much worse problem is number 2. As you gain faster and faster, especially beyond 0.5% body weight per week, the fractional increase in body fat just goes nuts. So like if, a normal conditions, intermediate with good genetics, good setup, they can gain roughly, in some cases, 50% muscle and 50% fat. Half and half. That's not terrible, right? It's a lot of muscle. If you go 1%, 1.5% body weight per week, we can see ratios of like 8-1, 9-1, fat to muscle. Holy crap. Like, folks, fat is easier to get rid of than muscle, but not in a 10-1 ratio. And as a matter of fact, if you gain 20 pounds of fat and 2 pounds of muscle or 3 pounds of muscle, 20 pounds of fat's a lot to lose. You might actually lose most, if not all, the muscle on the way down, right? Which I think is an independent problem we get here. So basically, yeah, the ratio works, but if you skew to really, really high rates, the ratio starts to not work in your favor. You gain tons of fat and not enough muscle to justify that fat gain, either on a timeline basis, health basis, you name it. Definitely appearance basis. It's tough to tell your friends you're a bodybuilder when you're 30% body fat, right? So you definitely gain more muscle, right? But the ratio's off, so that's point number 3. And here's the thing, here's the worst part. As you add more and more body fat, your P ratio, it's called your partitioning ratio, is how many of your calories and nutrients go to muscle versus fat, gets worse and worse and worse. We have good reason to believe that. So if at 10% body fat, you could, from 10 to 15% body fat, you could gain a decent amount of muscle and not so much fat. 15% body fat to 20% body fat, as you keep going and gaining super fast, your fat gain skyrockets and your muscle gain actually starts to decline a little bit. You still gain muscle, but not as fast rates. So it's not just that the majority of gains are fat from the get-go with a super, super high surplus. It's the longer you do that surplus, the worse the ratio is. And that's real bad news, right? We don't want to do anything like that. Here's another addition. As you get mega fat, because if you want to do this and it's going to work, you got to do it for months. As your body fat really gets out of control, your training performance suffers, right? Good luck doing sets of 15 in the squat when you're super out of shape. I've been there. It's awful. Your hormones start to misbehave, particularly natural testosterone secretion still occurs just fine. You have plenty of testosterone when you have a high body fat, but your conversion of testosterone to estrogen increases pretty much linearly with how much body fat you have. So you started out having a lot of test and not a ton of estrogen, great environment for muscle gain. At the end of that process, when you're super duper fat, you're producing a ton of estrogen, which is good for strength gains, actually pretty decent for muscle gains, but is a sort of positive feedback loop for more and more fat gains. Bad deal for sure. Your health is being degraded, right? So if you get super fat all the time on muscle gain phases, you're paying the piper the entire time, or you're taking months off your life every time you're doing one of those phases. Not an exaggeration. You do decades of those phases, you've taken years off your life, no debate whatsoever. And in addition, there's an inflammatory effect of high body fat. Right? The higher your body fat, the higher your systemic inflammation. Not terrible thing, but it probably doesn't go super well with recovery, with injury management, and even with hypertrophy. You want to keep your systemic inflammation, your chronic inflammation relatively low, and use pulsatile inflammation around the training process. That goes south when you gain super fat, so I probably made a pretty decent case. Getting out of hand fat, it's not neutral. So people say like, oh, I do the Oreos and milk diet when I gain weight, and I gain a shitload of strength. I don't give a fuck about being fat because I don't give a shit. I want to be huge. Like, that's all good and well, but, there's not a neutrality there. That's not like, oh, but just if you can psychologically handle the fat, you'll be fine. Well, no, if it's a ton of fat, it has all these other physiological effects, which are not bad only for muscle gain and performance, but other parts of your life, and your life particularly is how long it's going to be, right? Lastly, and I mentioned this earlier, you're going to have to do a mega diet or multiple diets at some point to get leaner again, to reset all those things so you can gain productive muscle, right? Because you can't super be fat forever. You probably want to look jacked at some point and not just like a balloon. And even if, you're okay looking like a balloon just to stimulate more muscle gain, you probably want to get leaner. It's going to take a long time to get leaner, a high fatiguing long diet that's probably going to risk some of that added muscle. So basically, you put on weight so fast and so much fat that now you have to cut so much fat in order to get back to lean that you might risk the very muscle you put on. Boy, is that shooting yourself in the foot. Real bad deal. Right? Moderate gain rates are better for all of these respects. Right? They're absolutely better. So that takes us into the following discussion of what are the best gain rates, right? So you can gain slower than 0.25% of body fat, or 0.25% of body weight per week. You can do it, but you'll have to explain why, right? So if someone tells you, hey, I'm gaining really slow, your first question shouldn't be like, how are you doing it or something? You should be like, why are you getting that slow and not faster, right? Then they're going to have to give you a pretty good answer. And you can gain faster than 0.5%. Right? There are situations in which you can, if you're really like rank beginner, amazing genetics, something like that. But you'll have to explain why, right? You can't just be like, oh, well, this just goes normally. I just do this. It's not normal. It's not usually going to work. So you're going to have some really good reasons for it, right? And here's where we get into the specific recommendations. Individuals prone to rapid muscle gains with minimal fat gains, fuck all of you, wherever the hell you are, you cheating bastards, right? You can start closer to 0.5% per week. Why? Because you're going to gain a lot of muscle. You don't usually gain a lot of fat. Why would you pitter around at the low end when you can have high-end gains? Totally. And the thing is, I just insulted all of us because almost all of us are prone to rapid muscle gains with minimal fat gains when we start lifting and we start scientific dieting for the first time. So beginners, probably closer to 0.5%. It's pointless to start training and lifting, and unless you're like, super duper high body fat, you can probably gain at pretty aggressive rates. Now, those who gain muscle relatively easily, but gain fat easily as well, probably want to start closer to 0.25%. Why? Because they gain muscle relatively easily, they don't need the big boost of 0.5% to really potentiate muscle gain with a real hypercaloric diet, right? They'll gain muscle no problem, but because they gain fat relatively easily, they want to be easy on the weight gain because it's going to cause a lot of fat gain. So 0.25% is probably a good recommendation for them. So what if you're option number 3? You're someone who doesn't gain fat easily or muscle easily. That probably means that you're a relatively skinny person, right? A hard gainer, so to speak. And for folks like that, because they have trouble gaining muscle, they need some more oomph, some hypercaloric oomph. We say, oh, but hold on, they're going to gain a lot of fat. Well, they don't gain fat easily either, right? Skinny people don't gain super fat easily. They gain neither. So somebody who's relatively skinny and doesn't gain muscle super easily, they probably need to start closer to that 0.5%, a little bit on the higher end. Now, for folks who struggle with both, and it's unfortunate, and all advanced people struggle with both, folks that gain muscle relatively slowly and gain fat relatively quickly, right? You probably want to split the difference and go middle of the road, because either one of the extremes is going to cost you a little bit too much. If you're an advanced individual, if you're struggling with both, if you go super slow, you just might get a whole lot of muscle out of the process. If you go super fast, you get super duper fat. Split the difference for a start, and then find your own individual best results from there on. All right. Duration time. What is the problem of gaining for too short of a time? Let's say you only gained for about a month, and then you're like, oh my God, I'm getting super fat. Or you're like, damn, I got a ton of muscle. Let's start a fat loss phase. What are the problems there? Well, there's a concept of a settling point. Okay, and a settling point is very similar to a set point, but it's a little bit more malleable. It basically is the body weight that your body likes to settle at. Usually it's regulated by activity and kind of hunger cues. Like if you just eat however you're hungry and you're not stuffing yourself, and if you're active like you normally are, where does your body weight settle? Here's the deal. If you don't gain enough weight for your body's settling point to rise significantly, a lot of the muscle you gain might just not be very permanent. Your body's just going to go back down to whatever weight it used to weigh, and not much changes. All right? There's a part of weight gain that is intentionally disruptive of homeostasis. It's taking your body outside, if it's pulling it outside of its normal settling point and dragging it up higher to click it into place to a higher weight, a higher muscle mass that sticks. The way to do that is to go up high enough. And the only way to go up high enough, short of just eating Oreos every day and getting super fat and over a month, is to go multiple months and really not just get your weight up higher, but keep your weight up higher and get it up higher over a long time to really convince your body it belongs up there, right? If you don't, you might just shrink back to the same size over a couple of weeks and go, Jesus, I feel like I didn't even do anything, right? If you only gain for a month, especially if you go at the low rates, you might not even confirm that you gained any weight. Or if you go at a low rate of gains, but you gain for 6 months, then, even with a low rate of gains, you're going to confirm that your body weight has gone up. But even at a pretty fast rate of gain, a month, geez, that's like 2 pounds, maybe 4 pounds. That could all be body water, glycogen shift, water shift, etc. You want to be sure that your gain actually worked. You don't want to work on it so little that you're like, oh, I think it was a good month, but I'd have to do another month to be sure. And just do another month, right? So it could just be not enough time to even see if we had a working process. Point number 3, very, very interesting stuff. Some new literature coming out on this. There is probably a little bit of a difference, at least, between actual gains of contractile tissue or a fully functioning muscle with more sarcomeres, etc., and actin and myosin and everything, versus what are called preparatory gains, which could in part be more gains of the actual volume of the muscle, more gains in the sarcoplasm itself, right, the sort of the fluid of the muscle itself, maybe some more gains of titin, nebulin, and other connective tissue proteins that sort of work as, in our skyscraper analogy for the building, that maybe work as the frame of the building. You can gain a frame in a month. You probably can't fill the frame in with actual, printers and computers and walls and plumbing and so on and so forth. It probably takes longer. There's some really interesting data that after multiple weeks of gaining, even months, the actual contractile tissue didn't seem to go up yet. And this is in people who are training with weights and intentionally trying to gain muscle. So there's, this stuff may pan out in the future as one way or another, but to give ourselves the extra edge, we don't want to find out in 5 years that the first 2 months of any gain process is only just preparatory gain, or the first month, and that if we stop and go back, that just preparatory stuff just goes away and we never capitalize on it. So we might not actually have a lot of contractile tissue. This is probably very true for beginners more than advanced individuals, but potentially there's some variance there as well. I just wouldn't bet on a month or less of muscle gain, quote unquote, even if you look bigger because the cells have swelled, to be real lasting muscle growth, at least for that reason itself. Here's another one. Exercise selection, whether or not you pick the moves that work for you to put on muscle size. whether or not your technique is stable to one that allows you to overload and one that allows you to track. And if you're building momentum where you're overloading, getting stronger, overloading, getting stronger, overloading, getting stronger, and constantly producing really, really good effects for muscle gain, that takes time, right? You're going to find moves that fit you. You're going to stabilize your technique and just really begin to overload. And then after a month, you stop gaining mass and switch gears. You're really just catching that momentum. It's kind of like trying to learn a foreign language for a month and then leaving the country and going to another country. You might as well stick around for 6 months or so and learn stuff that actually sticks versus switching so fast that as soon as you start feeling the groove, you're ending the process. So for all those reasons, it's probably a really, really good idea to gain for longer than a month, right? And sort of to that point, people that stop really soon, if you're gaining good muscle and you can potentially gain more, why stop so soon, right? If muscle gain is a serious priority, maybe you can give it 2 or 3 months. Maybe you can give it 4 months, right? Why is there this rush to just do it for a month and then stop? We know it's not going to be a lot of size anyway. And if the going is good, let's keep getting it. Now, that logic only goes so far. What if we're gaining for too long? What are the problems there? Gain for too long, we're going to define as more than 6 months for especially a non-beginner. I think beginners can probably gain for like a year and be totally fine. But 6 months for an intermediate and advanced, there might be some problems there. Here's the deal. Proper gaining requires not just nutritionally gaining, but training to gain, which means, as we reviewed earlier in the introductory lecture, training at above minimum effective volume consistently, and somewhere between MEV and MRV, maximum recoverable volume, which means that you're going to be training hard fundamentally and at relatively high volumes. That's the way you gain muscle. Your body can't do that for longer than 6 months. It's going to need a break. It's going to need an isocaloric maintenance phase. And you can't gain during one of those because you're just, by definition, gaining pure body fat because you're not doing anything to gain muscle, right? So people say, I want to gain for 12 months straight. Can you really train to gain for 12 months straight? The answer is, unless you're a beginner, probably not. So you're going to need a break for at least that reason. Here's another one. If you gain, even at the low end of rate, for 6 months straight, you've gained 6% body weight. And at the faster end, 12% body weight. You probably got quite a bit of body fat to improve your partitioning ratio and just to get leaner again so you look like a lifter and you look like who you like. You probably need another fat loss phase then. So you can say, I'm going to gain weight for 12 months straight, and that might be some decent muscle there, but your fat's going to get pretty much out of hand. On that note, worse P ratios the further you go. So for example, if you've gained for 6 months, you gain a certain amount of fat, certain amount of muscle. If you choose to go for another month, month 7, month 8, you're really choosing to gain very suboptimal levels of muscle and very optimal, so to speak, levels of fat. You're just essentially planning to gain fat at that point. If you can live with yourself and if a little bit of muscle is worth it to you, fine. Or if the going's really good on muscle gain, fine. If you're a beginner, fine. But if you're not those things, man, geez, you're just kind of designing a program to get super fat and not a lot of muscle. It's tempting to keep going sometimes because your strength is still improving, but sometimes you got to call it quits, right? So all of those gain duration problems, they're pretty serious problems. So folks that are relatively advanced probably don't recommend sequential gaining, gain for longer than 6 months at a time. So where does that leave us with gain durations? Well, gaining phases of less than 1 month long is very speculative. It's just by no means clear they work super well, and they definitely don't work the best. If you're a beginner, I think it's probably okay to gain for up to a year at a time, right? Which is a hell of a lot of gains, but probably the only time you'll be able to pull that off. For intermediates, the cap is at 6 months or so, and for advanced individuals, probably 6 months or even shorter, or the results might not be so great. That doesn't mean that anything magical is going to happen. The results are going to be meh, and you could have got better results by taking a maintenance phase, reducing fatigue, taking a fat loss phase, getting rid of the fat, blank slate, and then going up and gaining more muscle again, right? 2 month gains can work. So you should say, okay, a month, 6 months, I'm going to gain for 2 months. They can work, especially if that's the max you have as an athlete with distinct competition dates plans. For example, let's say you're a powerlifter and you have a meet in 6 months, and your peaking phase takes a month, your strength phase, let's say, takes 3 months. That means 4 months are gone, and you only have 2 months for hypertrophy phase. Would ideally you take 4 months for hypertrophy? Yeah, but you got a meet coming up. You can't do that. So 2 months is okay, especially if it's something you're constrained to. Maybe it's not something we would design if we didn't have that constraint, but 2 months is fine. fine, right? 2 months is fine. The sweet spot for most people in most situations that aren't constrained by competition dates is going to be 3 to 5 months of continual gaining. That's where we get real good momentum, the real good stuff. And much more than 5 months can work under some circumstances, probably not the best in most cases. Less than 3 months is definitely totally cool, but you probably get the best gains, best momentum, the best bang for your buck if you really commit to the process for 3 to 5 months. Now, that's 3 to 10% weight gain. 3 to 5 months at the various conditions that we can potentially have, 0.25 to 0.5. It's no laughing matter, right? So, that's a lot of weight potentially. But here's the deal. If you opt for the high end of duration, 5 months, you probably want to opt for the slower rates because you don't want to gain a ton of fat. Like 10% body weight gain, even if 3% of that is muscle, which is amazing, that's 7% body fat. That's going to change the way you look. It's going to change your health for the worse. It's going to be a real difference, and it's going to be a hell of a time working that off later. That's not a mini cut. I mean, that's a cut, right? And if you are on the short end of the stick, if you're at 3 months of gain, then maybe you can go on the faster end and gain a little bit more weight and then cut it off later. So what this boils down to is 5 to 6% body weight shifts over a mass phase or a muscle gain phase is probably kind of the top end. If you're gaining more than 5% of your body weight in a dedicated massing phase, that's after body water is adjusted. So folks coming off of bodybuilding shows going from 160 to 190 pounds in 6 months, it's totally fine because 20 pounds of that was just body water at the front end. That's totally cool because you were dehydrated as crap. That's fine. But after you get into your momentum, 1 or 2 weeks after you start gaining, any more than 5% body weight gain is probably something that's just rushing the process. Is going to result in more fat for most folks. I said 6% body weight in the slides. 7, 8 is okay. Anything getting closer to 10 or above, probably needless, probably not the best idea. That's a lot of info in one presentation, unless it's really bad info. And then it's a lot of really bad info in one presentation. Folks, next time, I promise the info will at least be as good. Muscle gain periodization. We hinted at it today, right? We hinted at it in this lecture that, okay, so gaining can only go on for so long, and it can only be structured a certain way. And then we sort of said, well, there's these maintenance phases you might want to take, and there's definitely these fat loss phases. Next time we examine what the structure is going to look like, switching from one phase to another, how to sequence them for best results. I'll see you then.